Good day to each of you. This is Father John Paul and the team of the Tantor Ecumenical Institute in Jerusalem. With me is Father Jonas Masson and Sister Marie Feruza Maximos. Thank you for joining us for this fourth and final part of our online series presented by Mr. Jared Goldfarb. Father Jonas will now give us an update on this series as well as some other information before Jared immerses us into his presentation.
So hello to everyone. It's good to have you with us again today. Today is our last sessions of our series of 4 sessions with Jared Goldfarb. And last week we saw the relation between the temple, the synagogues, the rabbinic tradition, and at the time of Christ. Today, Jared, for the last session, is going to lead us into a session entitled From Destruction to Redemption, Jerusalem's Demise and the Messianic Rise. During this presentation, there will be a visit as well of the site of Qumran. So thank you again for being with us. Thank you very much, Jared, for also for being here with us and sharing with us all your knowledge about Judaism at the time of Christ. I leave you the floor now.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Greetings from Jerusalem. Nice to see you all. Our last session together for this particular course. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity both to kind of round out the topic that we've been exploring and also just to think back, process, contemplate the entire journey that we've taken together through the texts and through some of the sites in order to truly understand, or as much as possible in the limited amount of time that we've had together from session to session, the kind of contextual foundations for Jesus, for many of the stories of the New Testament, and certainly for the birth of Christianity. So I hope that you've been enjoying it so far, and I hope that this last session will maybe connect some of the dots. But on one hand, this session will definitely kind of leave us almost hanging off the edge of a certain cliff, in the sense that we're not clearly going to resolve all of the mysteries of post-temple Judaism as well as the birth of Christianity, but rather only try to maybe hint at some of the understandings we can glean from the historical texts, from the archaeology, from some of the rabbinic texts as to why things may have moved in the direction that they did. So hopefully we'll be able to appreciate that today. I'll start by sharing my screen and we'll head to my presentation. And I just want to quickly review a couple of the texts that we looked at the end of the last session on the last week. Hold on, I'm having a small issue here. Okay, I don't think my screen showed up, did it? Yeah. All right, let's try that again. Not sure what happened. It worked when we tested it. And there we are. Okay, whoo! So again, just a quick review of a couple of the texts that we looked at the end of our last session, when we tried to understand that the role of the temple in Jerusalem as a kind of a representation of the historic identity of the Jewish people was very much part and parcel of Jesus's life and his habits, and more than likely his Jewish identity. And so here we mentioned, we took a brief look at the second chapter of Luke, where we see the the circumcision of Jesus that takes place in the temple, as well as the bringing of Jesus as a young boy to the temple for a Jewish tradition that's called Pidyon Haben, the redemption of the firstborn. And I mentioned that while we don't know from any specific Jewish traditions that that ceremony had to take place in the temple, it certainly makes sense, as the temple was such a central, pivotal location and experience for the Jewish people. And then we saw there were a couple of sort of source texts for the second chapter of Luke, both from Exodus, which is the specific commandment to dedicate the firstborn of every human being, essentially, to God, and that is what we call in the Jewish tradition Pidyon Haben, the redemption of the firstborn. And then in Leviticus 12, just the idea of both the circumcision upon the 8th day, as well as the sacrifice that would be offered as a form of redemption of the uncleanness and the sanctity of the event of the birth itself. So we have just a couple of source texts, and we see how it could easily be understood that the temple plays a critical role in the lives of every human, even without a sense of willing ritual, just the circle of life. And the fact that you are always acknowledging the role of God, you are acknowledging the role of tradition and commandment, and thereby also the role of your history and your narrative in your day-to-day existence. We also then mentioned or looked at further along in a second chapter of Luke that Jesus's family was quite regular at the temple in Jerusalem in order to celebrate the pilgrimage festivals, the Feast of Matzot, the Passover festival, the Feast of Weeks, or Shavuot in Hebrew, and the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot. And so we can certainly glean an understanding that Jesus had a regular relationship with the temple, with probably the priestly authorities who administered all of the rituals, and certainly with the experience of being a descendant of Israel by showing up when everybody in the community, at least on paper, was expected to be there to celebrate these moments in Jewish time. Of course, we also mentioned from Matthew 21 that there was some tension that we've been looking at all along. This tension between the kind of ideal notion of what having a sacred house of God might mean for the Jewish people, especially in light of the commandment that we looked at from the book of Deuteronomy, where we read more than one time this notion of showing up, of being present before God in order to honor God's role in your life, and that whatever blessings that you might receive from God, you have an obligation to give some of that back to God in creating this cyclical relationship called monotheism. But at the same time, as we have journeyed together through history, through the Roman Empire, through the struggles of the Jewish community relating to the presence of Rome in Judea and in the Galilee, we also see that Judaism and Jewish institutions have started to change. And so we notice that with King Herod's temple and the construct around the temple ever expanding, thus accommodating more and more different populations, different activities, and other institutions within its midst, perhaps, as we read in Matthew 21, the lines between sacred space and mundane space, between what is my tradition and what is not my tradition, between my sense of autonomy and control over my own destiny based on my beliefs and my traditions versus another power coming in to assert their culture and practices. Those lines are being blurred. And we've seen that in many different ways be it the text of Josephus that talked about the various different Jewish communities and how they all essentially live Jewish differently, as well as how they relate to Rome differently. And here in Matthew 21, we sort of see it by almost through a lens of architecture, that there were certain areas, perhaps of the ever expanded Temple Mount institution, where there maybe should and can be a mundane act like the tables of the money changers, like an economic reality. And then maybe there should be an area that is not open to those sorts of activities because of a central sanctity. And so the movement, the shift of some of those areas, perhaps closer and closer to the house of God at the top of the hill, are what frustrates Jesus, similar to how we see many in the Jewish world frustrated in trying to provide practical responses, theological responses to much of the chaos that seems to be enveloping them during this time, largely due to the presence of the Roman Empire. Now, of course, with Jesus's relationship to the temple, his seemingly strong relationship with the temple as a Jewish institution, right? Obviously, with the priests, he's got a very different kind of relationship, although I think we've seen that he wasn't alone, right? Many within the Jewish world were struggling with this kind of notion of the Sadducee community, the aristocracy, who were largely being viewed as corrupt. So, but we want to now balance out our understanding of Jesus at the temple and Jesus's perhaps commitment to continue showing up in Jerusalem to play that role of Jew within the context of Jewish history, with a new institution that is showing up on the scene. By Jesus's life, there's a good chance that this institution has been around for maybe even a couple of centuries, although maybe not very well known because it is quite grassroots. It doesn't come from any formal sense of Jewish tradition. And that is, of course, the synagogue, right? The house of assembly, or the house of gathering, to use the translation of the Greek word synagogue. In Hebrew, we still refer to that institution in the same way, Beit Knesset, a house of gathering, a house of assembly, meaning that the initial response, essentially, to perhaps a form of institutional crisis, where you're viewing not just the beauty of the temple and the potential of your relationship with God at the temple, but you're also seeing maybe corruption and the blurring of lines and many other associated problems. So your response could be to find a slightly different arena in which to continue strengthening your Jewish identity, your Jewish practice, your Jewish ritual, while trying to leave out perhaps some of the corrupt practices of the elite who control the temple institution. And so, just again, as a very superficial example, we don't have time to go into the entire textual mass of this, but in John 18, we read, "Then the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered, 'I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together.'" So again, just one example of many where Jesus acknowledges that the synagogue apparently plays a critical role in his life, but we need to understand contextually that the synagogue was not a given at that time. We don't know that there were that many synagogues even in existence during the time of Jesus. And as a matter of fact, many of the earliest archaeological excavations that seem to indicate a first generation of synagogues are actually from the time of Jesus. So it's quite possible that Jesus and his colleagues, his peers, his Jewish world were among the first generation to make use of this new concept of a house of gathering where Jews would come together in a perhaps a special space that was not the temple, that was not Jerusalem, and didn't really fit in to any other previous construct within Jewish tradition. So I want to share with you a little bit about the existence of the synagogues before we go to visit Qumran. And so here now I'm sharing with you one of the earliest archaeological pieces of evidence, of course, assuming that it eventually shows up on your screen. God bless technology. Hold on. It looks like you don't see it like I see it on my screen. So let's try again. All right, Zoom doesn't seem to like me today. So bear with me. Oh, there it is. Okay, it's a little slow. Maybe it got on the wrong side of bed this morning. So we are looking at something called the Theodotus Inscription, which is an archaeological find that was discovered in the area of the city of David. If you'll remember our little journey from last week, where we looked at the pool of Siloam and the area just outside of the old city, the walled city that we think of today. So in this ancient archaeological space, we discovered an inscription that reads, Theodotus, son of Venetos, the priest and head of synagogue, son and grandson of a head of synagogue, who built the synagogue for purposes of reciting the law and studying the commandments, and the hostel, chambers, and water installations to provide for the needs of travelers from abroad, and whose father, with the elders and Simonites, founded the synagogue. So again, this is one of the earliest inscriptions that hints at an institution called synagogue, and this is from around the same time period as Jesus, meaning roughly the 1st century of the Common Era. You can see the inscription is in Greek, right, which was taking over from Aramaic as a language used more and more within the worlds of Judea and even up in the Galilee. And that, of course, is the influence of the outside culture, the Roman Empire. And specifically, we have a reference to what the synagogue perhaps was meant to do, being not just a house of learning and focusing on the laws and the commandments, right? After all, Judaism has always been this passing down of the legal tradition, but now we're actively engaging in it. We're talking about it. We're reciting it. We're studying it, and we could perhaps assume, knowing much of the reality of the early rabbis and of Jesus himself, they are interpreting the text. They are trying to understand the deeper meaning of what God wants from them, especially in a time of chaos when a lot of things are changing around them. And the one institution that is meant to represent God maybe doesn't speak for the entirety of the Jewish world in the way that it used to, because of these enlarging gaps within that Jewish world, like we saw with the Josephus text about the various sects. So with this, we can understand that the evolution of the synagogue is really just perhaps a core response to a Jewish need to create space, to have a space that is dedicated towards dealing with the questions of being a Jew in a new world. And using the foundation of the law, the text, the commandments, they are able to answer very real practical questions, like, for example, the text from the Talmud that we looked at, I think it was 2 weeks ago, maybe last week, I can't remember, where we examined things like the bathhouse, the theater, and all sorts of other Roman cultural elements, and to what extent Jews could engage with them, and how there were different ways to play with the Hebrew textual tradition in order to perhaps accommodate these new realities. These elements are going to be fleshed out within the context of this new institution called a synagogue, a house of gathering, giving Jews the space to engage in these conversations. While we have the Theodotus inscription, we don't have the synagogue that it refers to, at least not definitively. We have yet to find this early synagogue in Jerusalem, although there are a couple of candidates. We're still looking. However, we do have some wonderful examples of what may be, again, the first generation of synagogues in the land of Israel. I'm going to have to start pressing the button a lot earlier to wait for the pause until Zoom catches up with me and shows you the image that I would like you to see. There we go. Okay, so this is a site that many of you might find familiar. This is Kfar Nachum, the village of Nachum, otherwise known as Capernaum or Capernaum. And here we see a synagogue actually that is much, much later than the time of Jesus, probably from somewhere in the vicinity of the 4th century of the Common Era. However, I specifically chose this angle to share with you of the photo because if you look at the lowest level of stones, essentially the foundation of the synagogue, or what we believe to be the synagogue of Capernaum, it is very clear that there is a different structure underneath this particular building. And it is believed, although we don't have yet any archaeological proof to this effect, but it is believed that the earlier structure, one that could easily date from the 1st century CE, was the previous synagogue at Capernaum, the one in which Jesus may have taught, as we see here, the verse from the 1st chapter of Mark. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus entered the synagogue and began to teach. So while this is not a perfect example of the earliest form of synagogue, it's a fantastic example, given that it matches quite nicely to the text, right? We actually have a building, we have a text, we even have a foundation that may have been the earlier rendition of the structure that then got built over, probably in order to expand upon and to maybe glorify the structure as the community develops in the centuries after Jesus. Going back to perhaps an even earlier synagogue, one that is now counted among perhaps the first of all synagogues in the land of Israel, is the one that you were looking at right now, which is the synagogue that has been excavated in the city of Magdala, or Migdal. Magdala, probably most well known as the presumed home of Mary Magdalene. And there has been a tremendous amount of work done at this site, specifically just over the last decade and a half, almost 2 decades, where a synagogue that you are looking at today has been identified and cleaned up and is now accessible to visitors really just in the last number of years. It's a relatively new experience for many travelers to the Holy Land. And this, again, seems to be among the earliest examples of this dedicated space for the assembly, the gathering of a Jewish community in a bit, at least at that time, of an unexpected way, right? They're not doing the obvious as dictated in the text, marching to Jerusalem on pilgrimage to offer their sacrifices, but rather convening to discuss the texts and debate the laws. One of the more amazing finds from this particular synagogue here was a relatively small stone that you can actually see in the larger picture. And hopefully when Zoom catches up to me, you'll now see it in a smaller picture. There we go. And this is a carving. If you look really carefully, it's a carving of the menorah, the 7-branched candelabra that, at least according to all textual indications that we have, only stood one place, inside the temple. And it's quite possible that because of the age of the synagogue, and because we're able to identify it with the Jewish community that existed while the temple was standing in Jerusalem, it's very possible that this carving of the menorah was in fact done by somebody who had either seen the menorah himself or herself, perhaps, by being in the temple in Jerusalem, or it was a firsthand account. Because remember, of course, that only priests were supposed to be inside the structure of the temple, and so maybe they were able to relate its precise design so that an artist could replicate it on a rock as a decoration or an inspiration for this early synagogue structure. So again, just a fascinating world exploring really the birth of a new tradition. Little did they know, right? Jesus and the many rabbis of that first century CE, little did they know where the path of the synagogue institution would take them, right? Where today, in the year 2021, all around the world, pretty much everybody on the planet, when they hear the word Jewish, they identify it with synagogue, right? That is the Jewish institution. 2,000 years ago, nobody really knew what a synagogue was. It was just coming into play and very much in formation. One last synagogue I want to share with you, and then we'll move to Qumran, and that is the synagogue at Masada. If you've been to Masada, the desert fortress on top of a mountain where the zealot community, specifically the Sicarii that we read about in the text from Josephus, I think it was last week, it may have been the week before, mentioned this kind of runaway hideout in the desert where these extremists, very, very extremists, who were very, very much into violence against their fellow Jews, hence the name Sicarii, the dagger people. They apparently took over this mountaintop spot, which had been the fortress or one of the fortresses and palaces of none other than King Herod, and simply decided to continue their Jewish existence while chaos was increasing in Jerusalem. And so part of their tradition, apparently, when they moved to Masada, which was not previously a Jewish community, they felt the need to create a space that we would now call a synagogue, right? A room essentially that enables the gathering, the community experience, looking at each other, talking to each other, and presumably debating the rituals and traditions of their Jewish existence. So again, just another wonderful example of some of these earliest synagogue institutions that clearly played a role in the life of Jesus and his disciples as avenues for them to explore Jewish identity, to share wisdom on Jewish teachings, and maybe most importantly, to try to interpret their way through this very hazy cloud of relationship between monotheism and polytheism, Judean culture and Roman culture, you name it, right? All of those backs and forths. This was the space where you could navigate those conversations. So if now we're already in the Judean desert, and many of you probably know that Masada hovers beautifully high over the shore of the Dead Sea, if we were to just head up the road a little bit on our way back towards Jerusalem, towards Jericho, we would bump into another site that is probably just as, if not more famous than Masada, and that is the site of Qumran. So as I'm speaking, I'll just show you a little video, a nice aerial of the site of Qumran. Many of you have probably been there before, so you'll be familiar with some of the sites. Qumran is famous for two things mostly. First and foremost, the archaeological site that seems to indicate some form of community living on this particular plateau just at the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. And all of the archaeology that you're now seeing on your screen tells us a little bit about maybe who was there, what they were doing, how they lived their existence in this desert space. But the other thing that is probably even more well-known, which you're seeing now, are the caves in the area around the archaeological excavations, which starting in 1947 proved to be the home of a wealth of Jewish documents, of scrolls that we now refer to as the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? Many, many, many copies of sacred texts, many sectarian texts reflecting on life, politics, and theology, many interpretive texts trying to dig deeper into the meaning of Jewish tradition, all sorts of interesting material that is easily available now to the world itself. And so Qumran is a fascinating site where we're able to link up perhaps some of these different elements within the Jewish world. On one hand, we have indication from historians like Josephus that perhaps some of the folks who were present at Qumran, who were part of a community that at least Josephus referred to as the Essenes, were in fact extracts of the Sadducee community, of the priestly class. I'll go ahead and, whoops, I'll play the video again in case you missed any of the wonderful visuals while I'm still talking about the site. So some of them may have been extracts from the priestly community, perhaps dissatisfied with the realities in Jerusalem and deciding to come out to focus on maybe the spiritual life in the desert, while at the same time, they are identified, at least in some ways, as not exactly mainstream, right? Some sort of fringe community, perhaps like some of the zealot communities, but more than likely less violent, clearly not identified like the Sicarii, right, by their weapon of choice, but maybe more identified with a spiritual fringe element, a little bit more of an extreme focus on spiritual life, especially given that some of the community we know from Josephus were all male celibate communities, right? They left that world of procreation in order to focus on their kind of spiritual issues. And at the same time, they are also clearly convening in a way that the rabbinic community was convening within the synagogue space. And while we don't specifically know that we have found a synagogue space at Qumran, we can certainly get a sense of this very intense communal existence, where I think we even read in the text that Josephus points out that you have to give up all of your possessions when joining the community, specifically to show your dedication to community, and that you would go through the rituals of your day-to-day existence together, whether it's eating, praying, going to the mikveh, the ritual bath, studying the texts, doing crafts, right? Everything is all done as a community. And so we see some of those elements also coming together here. And I think I even mentioned last week that perhaps the fringe element or the ability to reinterpret some of the Jewish traditions, especially, for example, in the context of ritual purity, the idea of going to the mikveh and constantly ascertaining your status, right, before the presence of God, making sure that you are constantly pure, may have eventually evolved over time to the practice of baptism, given that we know that John the Baptist spent time in the desert. John the Baptist was clearly active at the Jordan River, at least according to the New Testament text, which is literally just a few steps away from the site of Qumran. And obviously, Jesus and John had a very close relationship, not just in terms of family relations, but I think very much just in terms of ideology, right? What they were trying to accomplish by reaching out to the masses, by inspiring people, by teaching people. And so there's a lot that goes on at Qumran that we can also see having a bit of effect on what's to come next. The one element that we haven't yet addressed that is very important to sort of just recognize about some of the scrolls that come out of Qumran, maybe not quite as relevant archaeologically speaking, I'm not sure how we would indicate this, but in terms of the scrolls that are found in the area of Qumran, one in particular sheds an interesting light on perhaps the theological/political state of mind of many of the Jews living at the time of Jesus and shortly thereafter, around the time before, during, after of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And that, of course, is called the War Scroll. Just one example of a number of different texts from 2,000 years ago that mention this particular concept. But this particular scroll seems to make pretty clear that something big is going down. Whether it was meant to be understood in a very human context or in some sort of theological context, we're not sure. But just as an example, I excerpted this quote here: "On the day of calamity, the sons of light shall battle with the sons of darkness amid the shouts of a mighty multitude and the clamor of gods and men to make manifest the might of God. And it shall be a time of great tribulation for the people which God shall redeem. of all its afflictions, none shall be as this, from its sudden beginning until its end in eternal redemption. A little evocative, I think you might agree, with sort of the concept of Armageddon, right, from the book of Revelation. And so, and those texts are not that far apart, we would have to assume, in terms of the chronology of our archaeological discoveries. And so this notion that perhaps all of the things that we've been exploring together, this journey of seeing the influence of Rome, the response of the Jews, the rupturing of any sense of unity within the Jewish community, perhaps is directing us toward some sort of eschatological moment, right? Where some folks perhaps are envisioning an end, or perhaps maybe just a temporary end to one world and the beginning of another world. In Judaism, we might call it Olam Haba, the next world, the next universe. In Christianity, maybe we'll refer to it as the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God. This idea that whatever's going on, we have ruptured our sense of existence. Maybe we need some sort of reset, and God is going to get us to that next stage through either an all-out battle or simply just a highlighting of those who merit, right, that next stage. Here in this particular scroll, they are pitting the sons of light, we would assume associated with the authors of the scroll and everything that they believe, versus the sons of darkness, who we can only assume would be other Jews who are in their midst, yet don't agree, or are bringing oppositional notions to how Jews should live, how Jews should relate to the world around them, etc. So there's a lot of tension, right, that is going on here. And as we raise the stakes, and as we sort of bring it to perhaps a more spiritual level, we can now understand how, for the first time, really, at least according to all of our historical information, we, within that Jewish world, right, the Jewish world of all these different communities, within the first century of the Common Era in Judea, in the Galilee, for the first time, perhaps they are starting to re-understand a historic notion called the Anointed One. We know from our biblical sources that many human beings throughout biblical history were anointed as God's chosen leader, be it a prophet, be it a priest, be it a king, right? Over and over again, we see that reference to a living human being who is appointed to a particular position that just might be approved by God. And so the anointment, which happens literally through the rubbing of olive oil on one's head, becomes known as Mashiach in Hebrew, the anointing, Mashiach. And that, of course, is where we get the word Messiah. So if, in fact, historically, there was this idea of an anointing of somebody to lead the way forward, perhaps somebody who was approved of or even appointed by God, maybe now it's leaving the human realm to a certain extent, and really we're now engaging with the God realm itself, right? That the Messiah is no longer just your average human being who is going to become a prophet, a king, or a priest, but rather somebody who was maybe sent by God, maybe somebody who is the child of God, or maybe somebody who is literally God. However we understand that, again, different traditions are going to take that down different paths, but we start to see that more and more come out of this particular time period, very much enhanced by the chaos that would easily bring your average human being to think, man, this just can't be what God wanted from this world. So perhaps other than just getting totally depressed, I need to hope that there is an anointed one, right? Literally a Messiah. The Greek word, of course, Christ, Christos, that somebody is being anointed to come and save me, to redeem me. And so within that world, we clearly know from, once again, many different texts that Jesus is not the only individual who is seen as potential Messiah, Son of God, Redeemer, Savior, fill in the blank. There are many, many candidates throughout those generations. Obviously, within the Jewish context, certainly in my world, we more or less acknowledge that there hasn't yet been the true Messiah. We have had many false messiahs along the way, but we are still waiting if, in fact, the Messiah is to come. Clearly, the path of Christianity looks at that topic slightly differently. The Messiah is very well understood, was understood by a certain group of people while he was already here on earth, and then was taken away only to await his return. But all of those ideas, I think, are very clearly connected in this notion of redemption, right? The war to end all wars, the shift from this world to the next world. With that, I want to now move back to the world of Jesus as rabbi, as teacher, as interpreter. Obviously, with our limited time frame, it's very difficult to get too deep into all of these different notions, but I'm hoping that I'm highlighting enough of the different aspects here and there that you can see how Jesus fits into a number of these different categories, as do other Jews, but obviously we're focusing on Jesus for now. But I want to end with a couple of really important traditional Jewish texts that perhaps help us understand where the tradition is going to move next, how Judaism is going to survive post-temple. And by Judaism, I am more than happy to include in that, and I think most people should, all potential expressions of this monotheistic tradition as it evolves in the next stage, meaning what will eventually also become Christianity and a number of other sects as well. So I want to share, like I said, two more texts, and then we'll wrap up for questions, thoughts, processing, what have you. But again, I want to now re-anchor Jesus in the world of the rabbinic discussions, specifically because of the contextual understanding of how Judaism might see its own path forward beyond the calamity, right? Beyond the utter destruction of everything they know to be their rootedness in tradition, like the temple, the pilgrimage sacrifices, the priestly role. All of that is going to clearly come crashing down. This particular text that hopefully you are seeing on your screen, there it is, from the Babylonian Talmud, is probably one of the most famous texts for identifying that moment. It's a long text. I'll read through it quickly. Don't worry about the details. We just want to focus on the end of the text, but you need a little bit of story to make it come alive, right? So here we are in the tractate called Gittin, or documents. It is, in all senses of the word, a rabbinic digression from the discussion of documents. Here we go. Vespasian the Roman came and besieged Jerusalem for 3 years. The zealots were then in the city. The rabbis said to them, "Let us go out and make peace with the Romans." They would not let them and said instead, "Let us go out and fight them." The rabbis said, "You will not succeed." So the zealots rose up and burnt the stores of wheat and barley so that there was a famine. Abba Sikra, the head of the zealots in Jerusalem, was the son of the sister of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan sent him a message saying, "Come visit me privately." When he came, Rabbi Yochanan said to him, "How long are you going to carry on this way and kill all the people with starvation?" He replied, "What can I do? If I say a word to them, they will kill me." He said, "Devise a plan for me to escape. Perhaps I shall be able to save the city." He said to him, "Pretend to be sick and let everyone come to ask about you. Bring something evil smelling and put it next to you so that they will say you are dead." And so they opened the town gate for him and he was brought out in a coffin. When Rabbi Yochanan reached the Romans, he said, "Peace to you, O king. Peace to you, O king." Vespasian said, "Your life is on the line on 2 counts. One, because I am not a king and you call me king, and the other because if I am a king, why did you not come to me before now?" Rabbi Yochanan replied, "As for your saying that you are not a king, in truth you are a king, since if you were not a king, Jerusalem would not be delivered into your hand. As for your question, why, if you are king, I did not come to you now, the answer is that the zealots among us did not let me," right? And there you see, parenthetically, the internal Jewish squabbles, right? Rabbi versus zealots. At this point, a messenger came to him from Rome saying, "Get up, for the emperor's dead."
Jared, you muted.
Rabbi Yochanan said, "Give me Yavne and its sages." Some say he should have said to him, "Let the Jews off this time." However, he thought that that was too much to ask and that not even a few Jews would be saved. Again, we don't have time to go into too much detail here because I do want to do one last text before we wrap up. But very, very briefly, what do we see going on here? We see the rabbis, we see the zealots. They're literally at each other's throats. One definitely seems to be trying to kill the other one, or at least annihilate, the Jews of the city by burning the stores of food. And obviously this is clearly a rabbinic perspective highlighted in the rabbinic tome of the Talmud, but the rabbis see themselves as potential saviors to the system by negotiating with Rome, right? And through that negotiation, and obviously it's played up, this is clearly not historical, it is not archaeological, it's very fanciful. But how do the rabbis see the future of the Jewish world? That one sentence, "Give me Yavna and its sages." Rabbi Yochanan can ask for anything on the planet. He admits that he didn't think that the Romans would agree to save Jerusalem. So what does he ask for? Give me Yavne and its sages. Meaning, give me a small town off your radar screen, way out in the boonies, where nobody will bother us and we won't bother you, Rome, and let me take my rabbis with me. Because the future of the Jewish world is rabbinic debate, disputation, interpretation, like we have seen in our previous classes through the rabbinic texts. They see that that, in fact, is the only solution to this tragedy that is about to unfold, the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. So it's that genie in the bottle moment, right? In every movie where you can ask for one thing, and what does the rabbi decide is the most important thing for the future of Judaism? Let me have my new rabbinic tradition of debating the law, teaching the law, sharing the law in the synagogues with the general public. And that is how we will enable Judaism to continue without the house of God, without the sacrifices, the pilgrimages, the priests, etc. Okay? So clearly that is important in the contextual understanding of Jesus because that is the role that he is playing in foreseeing a path forward beyond the chaos that is described in the New Testament, right? The sinning, the falling off of the path, the people who are not obeying the word of God. Okay, one last text, and you'll all apologize. I know we're going a little bit over time, just a few extra minutes here, and then I promise we'll open it up for questions and answers. But this one really, for me, is kind of the summary of where the rabbinic movement moves next, and specifically how it opens up to so many different interpretations, including what will eventually become Christianity. Okay, so once again, a Talmudic text, this one from the tractate known as Baba Metzia. Again, a very complicated legal text. Don't pay attention to the details, just enjoy the story and listen for the end, the climax at the end of the story, at the end of the text. Follow me here. We learn elsewhere. If he cut the oven into separate tiles and put sand between each tile, Rabbi Eliezer declared it pure and the sages declared it impure. It has been taught on that day Rabbi Eliezer brought forward all the arguments in the world, but they, meaning the other rabbis, didn't accept them. He said to them, if the law agrees with me, let this carob tree prove it. The carob tree was then uprooted 100 cubits from its place. They said to him, no proof can be brought from a carob tree. He responded to them, if the law agrees with me, let the stream of water prove it. The stream of water then flowed backwards. They said to him, no proof can be brought from a stream of water. Again, he responded, if the law agrees with me, let the walls of the study hall prove it. The walls then began to fall. Just a pause for a minute in the text to understand who essentially is on Rabbi Eliezer's side. None other than God, right? Meaning Rabbi Eliezer says, let nature be entirely reoriented, and it happens. Clearly, only God can make that happen. So Rabbi Eliezer is essentially saying, I must be right, because God is on my side. But wait, let's go back to the text. Rabbi Yoshua rebuked them, saying, when scholars are engaged in a legal dispute, why do you have to interfere? Meaning, why does God have to interfere? So the walls did not fall in honor of Rabbi Yoshua, but they did not return upright in honor of Rabbi Eliezer, and they are still standing inclined. This is Rabbi Eliezer, said again to them, if the law agrees with me, let it be proven from heaven. A heavenly voice then cried out, why do you dispute with Rabbi Eliezer when the law agrees with him in every instance? Rabbi Yoshua stood up and said, it is not in heaven. Remember that phrase, it is not in heaven, from Deuteronomy chapter 30. What did he mean by this? Rabbi Yirmiyahu said, since the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, we no longer pay attention to heavenly voices. As you already wrote in the Torah at Mount Sinai, one must incline toward the majority. Rabbi Natan met Elijah and asked him, what did the Holy Blessed One do at that moment? He laughed and said, my sons have prevailed over me. My sons have prevailed over me. And so the last thing I'll leave you with as we kind of contemplate this crazy world of Jews and Jesus and disciples and moving forward, it is the Jewish concept, the Jewish understanding that the notion of God giving the law at Sinai essentially writes God out of the picture in an active way of defining the Jewish reality. So that essentially is not meant to deny God's existence or to deny the role of God in our spiritual being, but in terms of creating a new path forward, of surviving the destruction of Judea at the hands of Rome, it is clearly within the capacity of the rabbinic world to do so with no worries whatsoever. God has given them the power. It is now up to the rabbis and only the rabbis, right? All of the teachers to figure out, how do we take our next steps? How do we understand our tradition given any changes that may occur? And although Jesus may not be the most radical in teaching that, I think we can agree that he clearly believes in the interpretive tradition. And we're going to see, obviously, in the next generation, his disciples, specifically Paul, are going to take that to the next level by understanding what does it mean to be a part of our community, of God's community. We are going to decide, we are going to interpret our texts and our traditions, and we're going to pave that way forward, specifically because we are in survival mode. And so this notion, it is not in heaven, means it's up to us. And certainly from a Jewish contextual standpoint, I think that is a very beautiful and inspiring way to understand the role that Jesus plays as both rabbi, but also as redeemer. Because as this rabbinic community moves forward, it's going to continue to attract followers, whether they're following a quote unquote teacher, or they're following somebody they might call Messiah, right? Or Christ, but somebody who inspires them because they have that wisdom, they have the ability to impart and to guide, and they're going to be able to take those communities beyond the tragedy of the destruction in 70. And so that essentially allows these two traditions, Judaism and what will eventually become early Christianity, to continue and to blossom and develop all over the world. And I hope with that, we have covered a really great arc, a journey of trying to understand all these different aspects in really creating a backdrop to the New Testament and to the person of Jesus. Again, apologies, I went a little over there. I'd love to take some questions for as long as the folks in charge will let me.
Thank you, Jared, for this very, very rich presentation, and it gives a lot of thing to think about and to reflect on and to pray with as well. So questions. First one, can you elaborate on the kinds of corruption that the temple elites engaged in?
Ooh, the kind of corruption that the temple elites engaged in. Yeah, I can do that really, really simply just by reminding you of a text that we looked at. If I can find it really quick. Hold on, I'll share my screen again. And, well, Let's see if I can find it really fast here. Bear with me. We looked at this from the Talmud. It was a quote about, well, from a rabbinic perspective anyways, of, here we go. Yes. Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Psachim. Woe is me because of the house of Votus, woe is me because of their slaves, etc., because of their incantations, because of their pens, because of their fists, right? They are the high priests, their sons are treasurers, sons-in-laws are trustees, and their servants beat the people with stabs. Now, again, this is clearly a rabbinic perspective. Many of the priests might not admit to these transgressions, as it were, but this is certainly many of the various accusations that we see within the Jewish world. We also see references to some of these activities in the New Testament, just as an example of where they might be crossing some lines in terms of aggression, in terms of holding on to power, in terms of abuse of other sectors of society, and of course, just blatant nepotism and corruption.
Okay. Another question: could any teacher or rabbi teach in a synagogue, or they had to have a certain preparation to do so?
Ooh, interesting question. So just like, and I apologize, I actually didn't say this specifically, but just as the synagogue during the time of Jesus, we have to assume, was an entirely undefined institution, so quite possibly was the position of rabbi. There is no historic position or role for a rabbi in the Jewish world. We don't use that term. We don't see it as a function of kind of the structure of Jewish society. So it's not clear. However, the name might be the dead giveaway. The name rabbi, I think I did share this with you when we were talking about the Pharisees, comes from the Hebrew word rav, which literally just means great or greatness. So by calling somebody a rabbi, essentially you're just acknowledging that that person has something greater than your average other human. It could be wisdom, could be charisma, could be leadership capability, communal organizing. I mean, it really could be a lot of things. More than likely, it was directly connected to the relationship between that Rav and the Torah, or the textual Jewish tradition. So we do see that while the first generation of rabbis were not entirely sure of their source, right? Where do they get that acknowledgement? Where do they get that power? But we can definitely see as it progresses very, very quickly that it happens through passing of the torch, so to speak. A rabbi would sort of identify the brightest and students with most potential, and they would then become the inheritor of that particular rabbinic school or tradition or community. And this gives birth to something that today both of our faith traditions embrace, which is ordination, right? The idea that one generation has to pass the wisdom and the skills to the next generation, and through the laying of hands, we literally say, okay, you're ready now, right? And you take over, and that has to be then acknowledged by the community.
Thank you. Another question: would the members of Qumran and the more violent sect of Masada have been living in that area around the Dead Sea at the same time? Obviously, the Masada massacre by the Romans was later than Qumran.
Yes, Masada was definitely later than Qumran. We don't know exactly when Qumran was established, but it more than likely existed a bit before the Masada story happens. The folks who were at Masada were able to more or less identify their presence there for only a few short years, basically right from the beginning of the early years of the Great Jewish Revolt, as identified by Josephus, around the mid-60s of the first century of the Common Era, through its ultimate demise in the year 73. As far as we know, Masada was the kind of the penultimate disaster of the Roman forces, as they, long after they had destroyed Jerusalem, as they kind of traipsed through the landscape, trying to rid the periphery of any extremist communities, of any outpost, of any potential threat of return, right, or constant antagonism. So Masada was late and brief. Qumran was probably a little bit longer and started earlier, but definitely contemporary in terms of the bigger picture, right? The time period they're living in, the issues they're dealing with, the texts that they're producing or teaching, writing, etc.
Thank you. Talking about the son of darkness, why do you think this refers to other Jews rather than to the Romans?
That's a great question. I don't know how best to answer that one. As far as I am not an expert on the Dead Sea Scrolls, I am certainly not an expert on that particular scroll. Everything that I have learned and I have been taught over the years by the folks who are the experts simply indicated that that's our understanding. It probably has to do with all the wealth of companion texts, like the historians Josephus and Pliny, etc., as well as some of the other non-historical texts that just make it very, very obvious that there was such internal strife within that Jewish world. I believe there are also specific references. I know that the war scroll makes a reference to a sect that I believe fought on the side of the war of darkness called the Kittim. And I think that they were a Jewish sect, but I would need to check that because, again, that is not my area of expertise. Again, just a general understanding, largely because of context, that the most intense struggle, the most meaningful struggles were within and between the various Jewish sects, even though clearly the physical war was being fought between the Judeans and the Romans.
Okay. Among the diverse peoples at the time of Jesus, was there any progenitors of today's Palestinians?
Of today's Palestinians? I have no idea. I think we could possibly even say that we're not sure if there were any progenitors, if we're talking about genealogy anyways, of today's modern Jewish community. We certainly have absolutely no way of knowing whether we are definitively and genealogically connected to the people who lived in and around Judea 2,000 years ago. We certainly believe that we are, and we have many family traditions that we are, but scientifically, we're not there yet. So whether it's Palestinian, whether it's Israeli, whether it's Jewish or Christian or Muslim, I don't think it really matters. Generally speaking, we struggle to ascertain our genealogical roots. I should just mention, I also happen to be a genealogist, so I engage in that science as an obsessed hobbyist, but we generally speaking cannot engage our genealogical roots more than about 1,000 years ago. It's very, very difficult. So going back 2,000 years and trying to prove some sort of connection is beyond the realm of possibility at the moment.
Thank you, Jared. And the last set of questions about Yavne. So what question is, does Yavne still exist? And then what is the time period of the request of the rabbi for Yavne? Are we talking about the time of the destruction of Jerusalem?
So yes, excellent question. Yavne, we do have a candidate for the archaeological remnants of a Yavne. One of the things I very, very briefly hinted at when we were reading through the text was that perhaps the reason why Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai asked Vespasian, again, textually speaking, we don't know that that conversation actually happened, but why he asked for Yavne was probably because it was not a major metropolitan area, right? Meaning it's the kind of place that's not going to leave behind a vast wealth of archaeological remnants. But there are scholars who believe that we have uncovered ancient Yavne. The meaning of Yavne is less about the physical place and more about the institutions that are sort of kind of born there, institutions that already had a bit of a root during the temple times. Like, for example, we saw the Theodotus inscription. And so the synagogues, the court systems, the teaching apparatus, that's really the meaning of Yavne. Today, there actually even is a modern town called Yavne, which is just south of Tel Aviv, Jaffa, over closer to the Mediterranean coast. It's in the area because of the assumption of the historical roots of the community. But again, we're not 100% sure of that. What's most important is to understand that the procession of moving from Jerusalem to Yavne and then eventually up to the Galilee, to sites like Shfar'am and Usha, and eventually to a place called Tzipori, which you might know as Sepphoris, and then finally to Tiberias, that is a progression that is documented in the rabbinic texts. In the Mishnah and the Talmud, they talk about how those rabbinic institutions are evolving and developing and growing and essentially taking over the role of leadership within the Jewish community. So that's really the focus, less so on what we may or may not have actually found in Yavne.
Well, thank you very much, Jared, for everything. You've been great. Those last 4 sessions, really enriching our faith and our perspective on our faith. And so thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure and honor to have you with us. Now we are going to have our spiritual reflection led by Father Jean-Paul, Director of Tantour, that will help us to process and to make sense and to go deeper into all the informations we received.
Well, Jared, thank you for this presentation today, and especially it really captures the internal conflict and maybe the kind of that internal chaos that is very much a part of the topic for today, which is, from destruction to redemption, Jerusalem's demise and the messianic rise. Throughout this series, Jared has continually shared with us a narrative of chaos and division that's led to the buildup to the destruction of Jerusalem and the emergence of something new from all of that. And so, Jared, a special thank you for sharing such a wealth of knowledge with us. I connect to Jared's theme to something else that stirs within me. One of my favorite podcasts in the US, a weekly presentation by Krista Tippett, is called On Being. And each week she interviews in her podcast people from a variety of backgrounds, interests, and culture. What she also asks in her questions and interviews is, what animates you? What gives you life and energy? What impels you to do the things that you do? It ultimately is a question about spirituality and a connectedness with God, be that in a very conscious or unconscious manner, or be it directly asked or just simply implied. But one of the people that she interviewed a few years ago was a French geophysicist by the name of Xavier Lapichon, whose specialty was the Earth's plate tectonics. What does that mean? That means that it's those areas where different internal plates would come together deep underground. It's what the shifting of those platonic plates causes earthquakes. So as a geophysicist and as a committed Catholic, he had some very interesting things to say about God's presence and action in the world and in creation. What he speaks about in his talk is that with nature, within God's plan for life, there is a destructive force that is part of the chaos of life that can cause great harm and devastation to life. And yet, in the midst or as an outcome of that destructive force, there is a new order, a new life that is created. And so he uses several examples to explain this. He talks about how several years ago there was this devastating tsunami in Indonesia and South Asia that really killed thousands upon thousands of people. Its cause was a major breaking of the tectonic plates deep within the earth, from pressure being built up, tensions that had built up for thousands and thousands of years that finally explodes. Yet in the aftermath of that horrible event, new life has emerged slowly from that chaos that was caused, and life has been rebuilt. He also refers to another event of various volcanic eruptions that have destroyed millions of acres, destroys cities, countrysides, and has killed people. And so, for example, we all know of Pompeii outside of Rome, Krakatoa, Mount Etna's continual eruptions, and Kilauea in Hawaii. Tons of ash go into the air, molten rock bubbles up from the deep insides of the earth, and it causes destruction. And yet, in the midst of all of that, various minerals and essential life-giving elements are spewed forth to feed and to fertile the earth to eventually bring forth new life. Yet another example he uses is creation. Somehow exploding stars that are part of nature's elements at work, bursting forth in such destructive ways, and yet that still give life. So Jared has mentioned the destruction of the temple and the devastating impact upon Judaism in that era. It was an event that reminded people of the destructive power within humanity to destroy others and their beliefs. And yet, emerging from that destructive event and this ongoing tension and turmoil between the various groups, what has emerged was a new cultural and spiritual expression of a people's identity, how they live out their faith. So in this day and age, we witnessed the power of destructive abuse. We have witnessed destructive power of abuse. And yet, through that devastating destruction, we hopefully are beginning to see signs of a new order emerging from that experience that will give life for future generations. Is that not the Lord's Spirit at work, bringing about life through chaos, hurt, pain, and human suffering? For Jesus' followers, there also was devastation and destruction. Witnessing the brutality of Jesus' passion and death on the cross was an experience of shattered hopes, dreams, visions of God establishing a new order from the old. It caused fear. And it was enough for the apostles to hide behind locked doors or to even flee the city in hopes of escape. Yet our scriptures tell us that we're not left to deal with this destruction alone. Jesus enters into the midst of that destruction to open doors to new life. Life emerges out of destruction. And so the Lord who labors to bring forth life from chaos, from destruction, from brokenness, is still quite alive and active. As we progress to this particular icon of the crucified Jesus, It's from the chapel of Javier Castle, the boyhood home of St. Francis Xavier in the Basque province of Navarre. Obviously, what is striking in this corpus is the smile on the face of Jesus dead upon the cross. That smile is a reminder. Death and destruction is not the end. It does not win. The power of God is at work, bringing forth life from destruction. St. John Chrysostom's Easter homily expresses it quite well when he refers to death or destruction. O death, where is thy sting? Where is your victory? Death, you are now vanquished. Life has overcome. Maybe to kind of do a play on St. Julianne of Norwich, she says, all will be well. In the end, all manner of things will be well. And the play on that expression is, and if all manner of things are not well, it's not the end. And so the takeaway with all of this, from my perspective, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit still is laboring to bring forth life from chaos, from turmoil, from tensions, from destruction, from brokenness, from hurt, from suffering. I end with the words in a reflection from a Jesuit anthropologist, Teilhard de Chardin. Trust in the slow work of God, especially when we can be quite impatient to reach the end. And so a question to end with: where do you experience a certain sense of God bringing forth life out of destruction or diminishment?
Thank you very much for those reflections. So this is the end of our session. First, I would like to wish each one of you for your fidelity, for being with us, for sharing this program. I hope it was fruitful, and I hope that we could put a new light on your faith and on your daily life. I want to remind you that we have another program coming, which would be start at the end of November, and we'll cover the 4 Sundays of Advent. It's our Advent program in collaboration with the Ignatian Spiritual Center in Geneva, and the thematic is Christ, the King of Peace, and the thematic of each Sunday will be faith, hope, love, and peace. So if you want to join us for this new program, you're most welcome. You will find all information available on our websites. Also, last week we were in Jerusalem, and we saw some tourist groups. It's been a long time without this reality, a year and a half. So it's a great news. We finally saw some tourists and pilgrims coming into the city. So we hope that we'll be able to have our next program at Tantour in January, which is about Hakima. It's about discovering the Holy Land through women's eyes. So you're most welcome to talk and to share around you with people you know that our program are resuming this January. As well, we want to thank you for your donation. It will be easier if you want to donate money than what you received so far, because we have a secure website that will be soon put into place with Notre Dame, and so it will be easy to make a donation with your credit card now. So it will be something that will be soon put into place. Finally, as there is a survey, maybe you received already the survey. If not, you will receive it soon. Thank you for giving us your feedbacks, your impressions, in order for us to improve our program and to make new programs for the future that will be fruitful and interesting for everyone. So again, thank you very much. And we are looking forward to seeing you again in one of our program. Jared, thank you very, very much for your presentations. Father GP, thank you for your reflections. And Marie Feruza, that is the sister that is at Anto, which was doing all the technical thing. Thank you very much for that. All our friends who are here, we know we think of you and we pray for you. Thank you.